Rebirth and Karma, written by Sri Aurobindo way back in 1915. Rebirth. The theory of rebirth is almost as ancient as thought itself, and its origin is unknown. We may, according to our prepossessions, accept it as the fruit of ancient psychological experience, always renewable and verifiable, and therefore true, or dismiss it as a philosophical dogma and ingenious speculation. But in either case, the doctrine, even as it is in all appearance well nigh as old as human thought itself, is likely also to endure as long as human beings continue to think. In former times, the doctrine used to pass in Europe under the grotesque name of transmigration, which brought with it to the Western mind the humorous image of the soul of Pythagoras migrating, a haphazard bird of passage, from the human form divine into the body of a guinea pig or an ass. The philosophical appreciation of the theory expressed itself in the admirable but rather unmanageable Greek word met- metempsychosis, which means the insouling of a new body by the same psychic individual. The Greek tongue is always happy in its marriage of thought and word, and a better expression could not be found. But forced into English speech, the word becomes merely long and pedantic without any memory of its subtle Greek sense, and has to be abandoned. Reincarnation is now the popular term, but the idea in the world leans to the gross or external view of the fact and begs many questions. I prefer rebirth, for it renders the sense of the white, colorless but sufficient Sanskrit term Purna Janma, again birth, and commits us to nothing but the fundamental idea which is the essence and life of the doctrine. Rebirth is for the modern mind no more than a speculation and a theory. It has never been proved by the methods of modern science or to the satisfaction of the new critical mind formed by a scientific culture. Neither has it been disproved, for modern science knows nothing about a before life or an afterlife for the human soul, knows nothing indeed about a soul at all, nor can know. Its province stops with the flesh and brain and nerve, the embryo and its formation and development. Neither has modern criticism any apparatus by which the truth or untruth of rebirth can be established. In fact, modern criticism, with all its pretensions to searching investigation and scrupulous certainty, is no very efficient truth finder. Outside the sphere of the immediate physical, it is almost helpless. It is good at discovering data, but except where the data themselves bear on the surface their own conclusion, it has no means of being rightly sure of the generalizations it announces from them so confidently in one generation and destroys in the next. It has no means of finding out with surety the truth and untruth of a doubtful historical assertion. After a century of dispute, it has not ever been able to tell us yes or no whether Jesus Christ ever existed. How then shall it deal with such a matter as this of rebirth, which is stuff of psychology and must be settled rather by psychological than physical evidence? The arguments which are usually put forward by supporters and opponents are often weak and futile, and even at its best insufficient either to prove or to disprove anything in the world. One argument, for instance, often put forward triumphantly in disproof is that we have no memory of our past lives and therefore there were no past lives. One smiles to see such reasoning seriously used by those who imagine that they are something more than intellectual children. The argument proceeds on psychological grounds, and yet it ignores the very nature of our ordinary or physical memory, which is all that the normal man can employ. How much do we remember of our actual lives, which we are undoubtedly living at the present moment? Our memory is normally good, for what is near becomes vaguer or less comprehensive as its object recedes into the distance, further off seizes only some salient points, and finally, for the beginning of our lives, falls into a mere blankness. Do we remember even the mere fact, the simple state of being an infant on the mother's breast? And yet, the state of infancy was, on any but a Buddhist theory, part of the same life and belonged to the same individual. The very one who cannot remember it, just as he cannot remember his past lives. Yet we demand that this physical memory, this memory of the brute brain of men, which cannot remember our infancy and has lost so much of our later years, shall recall that which was before infancy, before birth, before itself was formed. And if it cannot, we are to cry, disproved your reincarnation theory. The sapient incipiency of our ordinary human reasoning could go no further than in this sort of ratiocination. Obviously, if our past lives are to be remembered, whether as fact and state or in their event and images, it can only be by a physical memory awakening which will overcome the limits of the physical and resuscitate impressions other than those stamped on the physical being by physical celebration. I doubt whether, even if we could have evidence of the physical memory of past lives or of such a physical awakening, the theory would be considered as better proof than before. We now hear of many such instances confidently alleged, though without that apparatus of verified evidence responsibly examined which gives weight to the results of psychical research. The skeptic can always challenge them as mere fiction and imagination unless and until they are placed on a firm basis of evidence. Even if the facts alleged are verified, he has the resources of affirming that they are not really memories but were known to the person alleging them by ordinary physical means or were suggested to him by others and have been converted into reincarnate memory either by conscious deception or by a process of self deception and self hallucination. And even supposing the evidence were too strong and unexceptional to be got rid by these familiar devices, they might yet not be accepted as proof of rebirth. The mind can discover 100 theoretical explanations for a single group of facts. Modern speculation and research have brought in this doubt to overhang all psychical theory and generalization. We know, for instance, that in the phenomena, say, of automatic writing, or of communication from the dead, it is undisputed whether the phenomena proceeds from outside, from disembodied minds, or from within, from the subliminal consciousness, or whether the communication is actual and immediate from the released personality, or is the uprising to the surface of a telepathic impression which came from the mind of the then living man but has remained submerged in our subliminal mentality. The same kind of doubts may be opposed to the evidence of reincarnate memory. It might be maintained that they prove the power of a certain mysterious faculty in us, a consciousness that can have some inexplicable knowledge of past events, but that these events may belong to other personalities than ours, and that our attribution of them to our own personality in past lives is an imagination, a hallucination, or else an instance of that self appropriation of things and experiences perceived but not our own, which is one out of the undoubted phenomena of mental error. Much would be proved by an accumulation of such evidence, but not to the skeptic at least. Rebirth. Certainly, if there were sufficiently ample, exact, profuse, intimate, they would create an atmosphere which would lead in the end to a general acceptance of the theory by the human race as a moral certitude, but proof in a different matter. After all, most of the things that we accept as truth are really no more than moral certitude. We have all the profoundest, unshakable faith that the earth revolves on its own axis, but as has been pointed out by a great French mathematician, the fact has never been proved. It is only a theory which accounts well for certain observable facts no more. Who knows whether it may not be replaced in this and another century by a better or a worse. All observed astronomical phenomena was admirably accounted for by theories of spheres and I know not what else, before Galileo came in with his, and yet it moves, disturbing the infallibility of popes and Bibles and the science and logic of the learned. One feels certain that admirable theories could be invented to account for the facts of gravitation if our intellects were not prejudiced and prepossessed by the interior demonstration of Newton. This is the ever perplexing and inherent plague of our reason, for it starts by knowing nothing and has to deal with infinite possibilities and the possible explanation of any given set of facts until we actually know what is behind them are endless. In the end, we really know only what we observe, and even the subject to a haunting question, for instance, that green is green and white is white, although it appears that color is not color but something else that creates the appearance of color. Beyond observable fact, we must be content with reasonable logical satisfaction dominating probability and moral certitude, at least until we have the sense to observe that there are faculties in us higher than the sense dependent reason and awaiting development by which we can arrive at greater certainties. We cannot really assert as against the skeptic any such dominant probability or any such certitude on behalf of the theory of rebirth. The external evidence yet available is in the last degree rudimentary. Pythagoras was one of the greatest of sages, but his assertion that he fought at Troy under the name of the Antinorid and was slain by the younger son of Atreus is an assertion only, and his identification of the Trojan seal will convince no one who is not already convinced. The modern evidence is not yet any more convinced than the proof of Pythagoras. In absence of external proof which to our matter governed sensational intellects is alone conclusive, we have the arguments of the reincarnationists that their theory accounts for all the facts better than any other yet advanced. The claim is just, but it does not create any kind of certitude. The theory of rebirth, coupled with that of karma, gives us a simple, symmetrical, beautiful explanation of things, but so too the theory of the spheres gave us once a simple, symmetrical, beautiful explanation of the heavenly movements. Yet we have now got quite another explanation, much more complex, much more Gothic and shaky in its symmetry and inexplicable order, evolve out of the chaotic infinities which we accept as the truth of the matter, and yet, if we will only think, we shall perhaps see that even this is not the whole truth. There is much more behind we have not yet discovered. Therefore, the simplicity, symmetry, beauty, satisfactoriness of the reincarnation theory is no warrant of its certitude. When we go into details, the uncertainty increases. Rebirth accounts, for example, for the phenomenon of genius, inborn faculty, and so many other psychological mysteries. But then science comes in with its all-sufficient explanation by hereditary, though, like that of rebirth, all-sufficient only to those who already believed in it. Without doubt, the claims of hereditary who have who uh, without doubt the claims of hereditary have been absurdly exaggerated. It has succeeded in accounting for much, not all, in our physical makeup, our temperament, our vital peculiarities. Its attempt to account for genius, inborn faculty, and other psychological phenomena of a higher kind is a pretentious failure, but it may be because science knows nothing at all that is fundamental about our psychology, no more than primitive astronomers knew of the constitution and law of the stars whose movements they yet observe with a sufficient accuracy. I do not think that even when science knows more and better, it will be able to explain these things by hereditary, but the scientist may well argue that he is only at the beginning of his researches, that the generalization which has explained so much may well explain all, and that at any rate his hypothesis has had a better start in its equipment of provable facts than the theory of reincarnation. Nevertheless, the argument of the reincarnation is so far a good argument and respect worthy, though not conclusive. But there is another more uh, clamorously advanced, which seemed to me to be on a par with the hostile reasoning from absence of memory, at least in the form in which it is usually advanced to attract unripe minds. This is the ethical argument by which it is sought to justify God's ways with the world or the world's way with itself. There must, it is thought, be a moral governance for the world, or at least some sanction of reward in the cosmos for virtue, some sanction of punishment for sin. But upon our perplexed and chaotic earth, no such sanction appears. We see the good man thrust down into the press of miseries, and the wicked flourishing like a green bay tree and not cut down miserably at his end. Now, This is intolerable. It is a cruel anomaly. It is a reflection on God's wisdom and justice, almost a proof that God is not. We must remedy that. Or if God is not, we must have some other sanction for righteousness. How comforting it would be if we could tell a good man, and even the amount of his goodness, for should not the Supreme be a strict and honorable accountant? By the amount of ghee that he is allowed to put in his stomach and the number of rupees he can jingle into his bank and the various kinds of good luck that accrue to him. Yes, and how comforting too if we could point our finger at the wicked strip of all concealment and cry at him, O thou wicked ones, for if thou wert not evil, wouldst thou in a world governed by God, or at least by good, be thus ragged, hungry, unfortunate, pursued by griefs, void of honor among men? Yes, thou art proved wicked because thou art ragged. God's justice is established, the supreme intelligence being fortunately wiser and nobler than men's childishness that is impossible. But let us take comfort. It appears that if the good man has not enough good luck and ghee and rupees, it is because he is really a scoundrel suffering for his crimes. But a scoundrel in his past life who had suddenly turned a new leaf in his mother's womb, and if yonder wicked man flourishes and tramples gloriously on the world, it is because of his goodness in a past life. The saint that was then having since being converted, was it by his experience of the temporal vanity of virtue to the cult of sin? All is explained, all is justified. We suffer for our sins in another body. We shall be rewarded in another body for our virtues in this. And so it will go on ad infinitum. No wonder the philosophers found this a bad business and proposed as a remedy to get rid of both sin and virtues, and even as our highest good to scramble anyhow out of a world so amazingly governed. Obviously, this scheme of things is only a variation of the old spiritual material bribe and menace, the bribe of a heaven of fat joys for the good and the threat of a hell of eternal fire or bestial torture for the wicked. The idea of the law of the world as primarily a dispenser of rewards and punishment is cognate to the idea of the Supreme Being as a judge, father, and schoolmaster who is continually rewarding with lollipops his good boys and continually canning his naughty urchins. It is cognate also to the barbarous and unthinking thinking system of sometimes savage and always degrading punishment for social offense on which human society unable still to find out or organize a more satisfactory way is still founded. Man insists continually on making God in his own image instead of seeking to make himself more and more in the image of God. And all these ideas are the reflection of the child and the savage and the animal in us, which we have still failed to transform or outgrow. We should be inclined to wonder how these fancies of children found their way into such profound philosophical religion as Buddhism and Hinduism, if it were not so patent that men will not deny themselves the luxury of tacking on the rubbish from their past to the deep thoughts of their sages. No doubt, since these ideas were so prominent, they must have had their use in training humanity. Perhaps even it is true that the Supreme deals with the child's soul according to the childishness and allow it to continue its sensational imagination of hell and heaven for a time beyond the death of the physical body. Perhaps both these ideas of afterlife and rebirth and of rebirth as fields of punishment and reward when needed because suited to our half mentalized animality. But after a certain stage, the system ceases to be really effective. Man believes in heaven and hell but go on sinning merrily, quit at last by a papal indulgence or the final priestly absolution or a deathbed repentance or a part in the Ganges or a sanctified death at Banaras. Such are the childish devices by which we escape from our childishness, and in the end, the mind grows adult and put the whole nursery nonsense away with contempt. The reward and punishment theory of rebirth, if a little more elevated or at least less crudely sensational, come to be as ineffective, and it is good that it should be so, for it is intolerable that man with his divine capacity should continue to be virtuous for a reward and shun sin out of terror. Better a strong sinner than a selfish, virtuous coward or a petty huckster with God. There is more divinity in him, more capacity of the elevation. Truly, the Gita has well said, Kripana Palahetava, and it is inconceivable that the system of this vast and majestic world should have been founded on these petty and paltry motives. There is reason in these theories, then reason of the nursery puerile ethics, then ethics of the muddy. The true foundation of the theory of rebirth is the evolution of the soul, and rather its efflorescence out of the wheel of matter and its gradual self-finding. Buddhism contains the truth involved in its theory of karma and emergence out of karma, but failed to bring it to light. Hinduism knew it of old, but afterwards missed the right balance of its expression. Now we are again able to restate the ancient truth in a new language, and this is already being done by a certain schools of thought, though still the old incrustations tend to tack themselves on the deeper wisdom. And if this gradual efflorescence be true, then the theory of rebirth is an intellectual necessity, a logically unavoidable corollary. But what is the aim of that evolution? Not conventional or interested virtue and the faultless counting out of the small coin of good in the hope of an apportioned material reward, but the continual growth towards a divine knowledge, strength, love, and purity. These things alone are real virtue, and this virtue is its own reward. The one true reward of the works of love is to grow ever in capacity and delight of love up to the ecstasy of the Spirit's all seizing embrace and universal passion. The one reward of the works of right knowledge is to grow perpetually into the infinite light. The one reward of the works of right power is to harbor more and more of the force divine, and of the works of purity to be freed more and more from egoism into that immaculate whiteness where all things are transformed and reconciled into the divine equality. To seek other reward is to bind oneself to a foolishness and a childish ignorance, and to regard even these things as a reward is an unripeness and an imperfection. And what of suffering and happiness, misfortune and prosperity? These are experiences of the soul in its training, helps, props, means, discipline, tests, ordeals, and prosperity, often a worse ordeal than suffering. Indeed, adversity, suffering may often be regarded rather as a reward to virtue than as punishment for sin, since it turns out to be the greatest help and purifier of the soul struggling to unfold itself. To regard it merely as a stern award of a judge, the anger of an irritated ruler, or even the mechanical recoil of result of evil upon cause of evil is to take the most superficial view possible of God's dealing with the soul and the law of the world's evolution. And what of worldly prosperity, wealth, progeny, the outward enjoyment of art, beauty, power, good, if they be achieved without loss to the soul and enjoyed only as the outflowing of the divine joy and grace upon our material existence. But let us seek them first for others, or rather for all, and for ourselves, only as a part of the universal condition or as a means of bringing perfection nearer. The soul needs no proof of its rebirth any more than it needs proof of its immortality. For there comes a time when it is consciously immortal, aware of itself in its eternal and immutable essence. Once that realization is accomplished, all intellectual questionings for and against the immortality of the soul falls away like a vain clamor of ignorance around the true, evident, and ever present truth. Tato na vi- visikitsate. That is the true dynamic belief in immortality when it becomes to us not an intellectual dogma but a fact as evident as the physical fact of our breathing and as little in need of proof or argument. So also there comes a time when the soul becomes aware of itself in its eternal and mutable movement. It is then aware of the ages behind the present organization of the movement, sees how this was prepared in an uninterrupted past, remembers something of the bygone soul states, environments, particular form of activity which builds up its present constituents, and knows to what it is moving by development in an uninterrupted future. That is the true dynamic belief in rebirth, and that too the play of the questioning intellect ceases. The soul's vision and the soul's memory are all certainly. There remains the question of the mechanism of the development and of the laws of rebirth, which where the intellect and its enquiries and generalizations can still have some play. And here, the more one thinks and experiences, the more the ordinary, simple, and cut and dried account of reincarnation seem to be of doubtful validity. That is surely here a greater complexity, a law evolved with a more difficult movement and a more intricate harmony of the possibilities of the infinite. But this is a question which demands long and ample considerations. For subtle it is the law of it, anur yesa dharma, the reincarnating soul. Human thought, in the generality of men, is no more than a rough and crude acceptance of unexamined ideas. Our mind is a sleepy or careless sentry and allows anything to pass the gates which seem to it decently garbed and wears a plausible appearance and can mumble anything that resembles some familiar password. Especially in this so in subtle matters, those remote from the concrete facts of our physical life and environment. Even men who will reason carefully and acutely in ordinary matter and therefore there consider vigilance against error an intellectual or a practical duty are yet content with the most careless stumbling when they get upon higher and more difficult ground, when precision and subtle thinking are more needed, then they are more impatient of it and averse to the labor demanded of them. Men can manage fine thought about palpable things, but to think subtly about the subtle is too great a strain on the grossness of our intellect. So we are content with making a daub of the truth like the painter who threw his brush at his picture when he could not get the effect that he desired. We mistake the smudge that results from the perfect form of a verity. It is not surprising that men should be content to think crudely about such a matter as rebirth. Those who accept it take it usually ready made, either as a cut and dry theory or a crude dogma. The soul is reborn in a new body. That vague and almost meaningless assertion is for them sufficient. But what is the soul, and what can possibly be meant by the rebirth of a soul? Well, it means reincarnation. The soul, whatever that may be, had got out of one case of flesh and is now getting into another case of flesh. It sounds simple, let us say, like the Jinn of the Arabian tale expanding out of and again compressing himself into his bottle, or perhaps as a pillow is lugged out of one pillowcase and thrust into another, or the soul fashions for itself a body into the mother's womb and then occupies it, or else, let us say, puts off one robe of flesh and then puts on another. But what is it that does leaves one body and enters into another? Is it another a psychic body and subtle form that enters into the gross corporeal form, the purusa, perhaps of the ancient image no bigger than a man's thumb? Or is it something in itself formless and impalpable that incarnates in the sense of becoming or assuming to the senses a palpable shape of bone and flesh? In the ordinary, the vulgar conception, there is no birth of a soul at all, but only the birth of a new body into the world occupied by an old personality and changed from that which once left some now discarded physical frame. It is John Robinson who had gone out of the form of flesh he once occupied. It is John Robinson who tomorrow or some centuries hence will reincarnate in another form of flesh and resume the course of his terrestrial experience with another name and in another environment. Achilles, let us say, is reborn as Alexander, the son of Philip, a Macedonian conqueror, not of Hector but of Darius, with a wider scope, with larger destinies, but it is still Achilles. It is the same personality that is born, only the bodily circumstances are different. It is this survival of the identical personality that attracts the European mind today in the theory of reincarnation. For it is the extinction or dissolution of the personality of this mental and nervous and physical composite which I call myself that is hard to bear for the man enamored of life, and it is a promise of the survival and physical reappearance that is the great lure. The one objection that really stands in the way of its acceptance is the obvious non-survival of memory. Memory is the man, says the modern psychologist, and what is the use of survival of my personality if I do not remember my past? If I'm not aware of being the same person still and always, what is the utility? What is the enjoyment? The old Indian thinkers, I'm not speaking of the popular belief which was crude enough and thought not at all about the matter. The old Buddhistic and Vedantist thinkers surveyed the whole field from a very different standpoint. They were not attached to the survival of the personality. They did not give to the survival the high name of immortality. They saw that personality being what it is, a constantly changing composite. The survival of an identical personality was a nonsense, a contradiction in terms. They perceive indeed that there is a continuity, and they sought to discover what determines this continuity and whether the sense of identity which enters into it is an illusion or the representation of a fact of a real truth, and if the latter, then what that truth may be. The Buddhists denied any real identity. There is, he said, no self, no person. There is simply a continuous stream of energy in action, like a continuous flowing of a river or the continuous burning of a flame. It is this continuity which creates in the mind the false sense of identity. I am not now the same person that I was a year ago, not even the same person that I was a moment ago, any more than the water flowing past yonder ghat is the same water that flowed past it a few seconds ago. It is a persistence of the flow in the same channel that preserves the false appearance of identity. Obviously, then there is no soul that reincarnates, but only karma that persists in flowing continuously down an apparently uninterrupted channel. It is karma that incarnates. Karma creates the form of a constantly changing mentality and physical bodies that are, we may presume, the result of the changing composite of ideas and sensation. That I call myself the identical I is not, never was, never will be. Practically, so long as the error of the personality persists, this does not make much difference, and I can say in the language of ignorance that I am reborn in a new body. Practically, I have to proceed on the basis of that error. But there is this important point gained, that in it is all an error, and an error which can cease. The composite can be broken up for good without any fresh formation. The flame can be extinguished. The channel which call itself a river destroyed. And then there is non-being, there is cessation, there is a release of the error from itself. The Vedantists come to a different conclusion. He admits an identical, a self, a persistent, immutable reality. But other than my personality, other than this composite which I call myself, in the Katha Upanishad, and the question is raised in a very instructive fashion, quite opposite to the subject we have in hand. Nachiketa, sent by his father to the world of dead, thus questions Yama, the lord of the world, of the man who has gone forward, who has passed away from us. Some say that he is, and others, this he is not. Which then is right? What is the truth of the great passes? Such is the form of the question, and at first sight it seems simply to raise the problem of immortality in the European sense of the world, the survival of the identical personality. But that is not what Nachiketas asks. He has already taken as a second of three boons offered to him by Yama, the knowledge of the sacred flame by which man crosses over hunger and thirst, leaves sorrow and fear far behind, him and dwells in heaven securely rejoicing. Immortality, in that sense, he takes for granted as already standing in that further world he must surely do. The knowledge he asks for involving the deeper, finer problem of which Yama affirms that even the gods debated this of old, and it is not easy to know, for the subtle is the law of it. Something survives that appears to be the same person that descends into hell, that ascends into heaven, that returns upon the earth with a new body, but is it really the same person that thus survives? Can we really say of the man he still is, and must we not rather say this he no longer is? Yamatu is his answer speaks not at all of the survival of death, and he only gives a verse or two to a bare description of that constant rebirth which all serious thinkers admitted as a universally acknowledged truth. Which he speaks of is the self, the real man, the Lord of all these changing appearances. Without the knowledge of that self, the survival of the personality is not immortal life, but a constant passing from death to death. He only who goes beyond personality to the real person becomes the immortal. Till then, a man seems indeed to be born again and again by the force of his knowledge and works. Name succeeds to name, form gives place to form, but there is no immortality. Such then is the real question put and answered so divergently by the Buddhist and the Vedantin. There is a constant reforming of personality in new bodies, but this personality is a mutable creation of force at its work streaming forward in time and never for a moment the same. And the ego sense that makes us cling to the life of the body and believe readily that it is the same idea and form, that it is John Robinson who is still reborn as Sidi Hossein, is a creation of the mentality. Achilles was not reborn as Alexander, but the stream of force in its work, which created the momentarily changing mind and body of Achilles, flowed on and created the momentarily changing mind and body of Alexander. Still said the ancient Vedanta, there is yet something beyond this force in action, master of it, one who makes it create for him new names and form, and that is the self. The Purusa, the man, the real person, the ego sense is only its distorted image reflected in the flowing stream of embodied mentality. It is then the self that incarnates and reincarnates. But the self is imperishable, immutable, unborn, undying. The self is not born and does not exist in the body. Rather, the body is born and exists in the self. For the self is one everywhere, in all bodies, we say, but really it is not confined and parceled out in different bodies except as the all constituting ether seem to be formed into different objects and in a sense in them. Rather, all these bodies are in the self, and that also is the figment of space conception, and rather these bodies are only symbols and figures of itself created by it in its own consciousness. Even what we call the individual soul is greater than its body and not less more subtle than it, and therefore not confined by its grossness. At death, it does not leave its form but casts it off, so that a great departing soul can say of this dead in vigorous phrase, I have spat out the body. What then is it that we feel to inhabit the physical frame? What is it that the soul draws out from the body when it casts off this partial physical robe which envelops not it but part of its members. What is it whose issuing out gives this wench this swift struggle and pain of parting, creates this sense of violent divorce? The answer does not help us much. It is a subtle of physical frame which is tied to the physical of the heartstring by the cord of life force of nervous energy which has been woven into every physical fiber. This the lord of the body draws out, and the violent snapping or the rapid or tardy loosening of the life cords, the exit of the connecting force constitute the pain of death and its difficulty. Let us then change the form of question and ask rather what is it that reflects and accepts the mutable personality since the self is immutable. We have in fact an immutable self, a real person, Lord of this ever changing personality, which again assumes ever changing bodies, but the real self knows itself always as above the mutation, watches and enjoys it, but is not involved in it through what does it enjoy the changes and feels them to its own, even while knowing itself to be unaffected by them. The mind and ego sense are only inferior instruments. There must be some more essential form of itself which the real man forth, puts in front of itself as it were, and at the back of the changing to support and mirror them without being actually changed by them. This more essential form is or seem to be in men the mental being or mental person which the Upanishads speak of as a mental leader of the life and body. Manomaya Prana Sarira Neta. It is that which maintains the ego sense as a function in the mind and enables us to have the firm conception of continuous identity in time as opposed to the timeless identity of the self. The changing personality is not this mental person, it is composite of various stuff of nature, a formation of prakriti, and is not at all the purusa, and it is very complex composite with many layers. There is a layer of physical, a layer of nervous, a layer of mental, and even a final stratum of supramental personality, and within these layers themselves there are strata within each stratum. The analysis of the successive couches of the earth is a simple matter compared with the analysis of this wonderful creation we call the personality. The mental being is resuming bodily life forms a new personality for its new terrestrial existence. It takes material from the common matter stuff, life stuff, mind stuff of the physical world, and during earthly life, it is constantly absorbing fresh material, throwing out what is used up, changing its bodily, nervous, and mental tissue. But it is all surface work. Behind is the foundation of past experiences held back from the physical memory so that the superficial consciousness may not be troubled or interfered with by the conscious burden of the past, but may concentrate on the work immediately in hand. Still, that foundation of past experience is the bedrock of personality, and it is more than that. It is our real fun on which we can always draw, even apart from our present superficial commerce with our surrounding. That commerce adds to our gains, modifies the foundation for a subsequent existence. Moreover, all this is again on the surface. It is only a small part of ourselves which lives and acts in the energies of our earthly existence. As behind the physical universe there are worlds of which ours is only a last result, so also within us there are worlds of our self existence which draws us their external form of being. The subconscient, the superconscient are oceans from which and to which the river flows. Therefore, to speak of ourselves as a soul reincarnating is to give altogether too simple an appearance to the miracle of our existence. It puts it too ready and too gross a formula, the magic of the supreme magician. There is not a definite psychic entity getting into a new case of flesh. There is a metempsychosis, a reinstalling, a rebirth of a new psychic personality as well as a rebirth of a new body. And behind is a person, an unchanging entity, the master who manipulates this complex material, the artificer of this wondrous artifice. This is the starting point from which we have to proceed in considering the problem of rebirth. To view ourselves as such and such a personality getting into a new case of flesh is to stumble about in the ignorance, to confirm the error of the material mind and the senses. The body is a convenience, the personality is a constant formation for whose development, action, and experience are the instruments, but the self, by whose will and for whose delight all this is other than the body, other than the action and experience, other than the personality which they develop. To ignore it is to ignore the whole secret of our being. Rebirth, evolution, heredity. Rebirth, evolution, and heredity. Two truths discovered with an erroneous Two truths, discoveries with an enormous periphery of luminous result and of a considerable essential magnitude, evolution and heredity, figure today in the front of thought, and I suppose we have to take them as a well established, unquenchable light upon our being, lamps of a constant luster, though not yet very perfectly trimmed, final so far as anything is final in men's constantly changing cinematographic process of the development of intellectual knowledge. They may be said to make up almost a whole fundamental idea of life in the way of seeing peculiar to a mind dominated fashion pressed into its powerful molds by the exact, curious, multifariously searching, yet in the end singularly limited observation and singularly narrow reason of our modern science. Science is in her own way a great seer and magician. She has both the microscopic and the macroscopic, the closely gazing and the telescopic view, a dissolving power of searching analytic resolution, a creative power of revealing synthetic effectuation. She has hunted to their lyre many of the intermediate secret processes of the great creatics and even She has been able, by the inventive faculty given to us, to go and do one better. Man, this midget in infinity locomotive, yet nailed to the contiguity of a petty crust of soil by the force of gravitation, has certainly scored by her a goodly number of points against the mother of the universe. But all this have been done in some perfection only in the limits of her lowest obtrusive physical field. Face to face with psychic and spiritual secrecies, as in the open elementary world even of mind, science has still the uninformed gaze and the groping hands of the infant. In that sphere, see so precise, illuminative, compelling in the physical, sees only the big blazing, buzzing confusion which James tells us with a possibly inaccurate vividness of alliterated phrase, is the newborn baby's view of the sensible world into which he has dropped down the mysterious stairs of birth. Science, faced with what are still to her the wonderful random accords and unexplained miracles of consciousness, protects herself from the errors of the imagination, but stumbling incidentally by that very fact into plenty of errors of an inadequate induction behind an opaque seal of catullus skepticism. She clings with the grasping firmness of the half drowned to planks of security. She thinks she has got in a few well tested correspondence so style, though the word as used explain nothing, between mental action and its accompaniment or of suggestive or instrumental physical functioning. She is determined, if she can, to explain every supraphysical phenomenon by some physical fact. Psychological process of mind must not exist except as result of rendering of physiological process of body. This set resolution, apparently rational and cautious, of ascertainable and firmly tangible truth, but really heroic in its paradoxical temerity, shuts up her chance of rapid discovery for the present, at least in a fairly narrow circle. It tends to her extension of physical truth into the psychological field with a pursuing sense of inadequacy, but this inadequacy in extended application is very evident in her theories of heredity and evolution when she forces them beyond their safe ground of physical truth and labors to illumine by them the subtle, complex, elusive phenomena of our psychological being. There are still, I dare say, persons here and there who cherish a secret or an open unfaith in the theory of a physical evolution and believe that it will one day pass into the limbo of dead generalizations, like the Ptolemaic theory in astronomy or like the theory of humors in medicine. But this is a rare and excessive skepticism. Yet it may not be without use of aptitude for our purpose to note that, contrary to current popular notion, the scientific account of this generalization, like that of a good number of others, is not yet conclusively proved, even though now taken for granted. But still there is, on the whole, a mass of facts and indications in its favor so considerable as to look overwhelming, so that we cannot resist the conclusion that in this way or some way the whole thing came about, and we find it difficult to conceive any more convincing explanation of the indubitable ascending and branching scale of genius and species which meets even our causal scrutiny of living existence. One thing at least seems now intellectually certain: we can no longer believe that the suns and systems were hurled full shaped and eternally arranged into boundless space, and all these numberless species of being planted on earth ready made and nicely tailored in 7 days or any number of days in a sudden outburst of caprice or Dionysiac excitement or crowded activity of mechanical conception by the fiat of a timeless creator. The successive development which was summarily proposed by the ancient Hindu thinkers, the lowest form of being first, man afterwards, as the crown of the spirit's development of life on earth, has been confirmed by the patient and detailed scrutiny of physical science and aeonic development, though the further Hindu conception of a constant repetition of the principle in cycles is necessarily incapable of physical evidence. One thing more seems now equally certain: that not only the seed of all life was one. Again, the great intuition of Upanishads foreruns the conclusion of the physical inquiry: one seed which the universal self-existence by process of force has disposed in many ways. Ekam bijam bahudha sakti yogat. But even the principle of development is one of, and the structural ground plan too, as it develops step by step in spite of all departures to this side and that in the workings of the creative force or the creative idea. Nature seems to start with an extraordinary poverty of original broad variety of conceptions and to proceed to an extraordinary richness of her minuter consequential variation which amounts to a forging of constant subtle differentiations of species, and in the individual a startling insistence on result of uniqueness. It almost looks as if in the process of our physical harmonies there was meant to be more formal effect or symbolic reproduction of the truth that all things are originally one being, but a one who insists on his own infinite diversity, and even a suggestion that there is this eternal unity and eternal pluralism, the infinite being self repeated in an infinite multiplicity of being, each unique and yet each the one. To a mind on the lookout for the metaphysical suggestions we can draw from the apparent facts of being that might not seem altogether an imagination. In any case, we have this now patent order in the profuse complexities of the natural harmony of living things, one plasmic seed, one developing ground plan, an opulent number of varieties whose logical process would be by an ascending order which pass up through fine but still very distinct gradations from the crude to the complex, from the less organized to the more organized, from the inferior to the superior. The first question that should strike the mind at once when this tree of life have been seen is whether this logical order was indeed the actual order in the history of the universe, and then a second naturally arising from that problem whether, if so, each new form developed by variation from its natural predecessor or came in by some unknown process of fresh independent and in a way sudden creation. In the first case, we have the scientific order of physical evolution. In the other one knows not well, perhaps the unseen demiurge who developed the whole thing in the earlier period of the Earth evolution and has now wholly or almost entirely stopped the business so that we have no new physical development of that kind, but only it may be an evolution of capacity in types already created. Science stands out for a quite natural and mechanical, a quite unbroken physical evolution with many divergent lines indeed of developing variation, but in the line no gap or interstice. It is true that they are not one but a host of missing links, which even the richest remains of the past cannot fill in, and we are not in a position to deny with an absolute dogmatism the possibility of an advance per saltum by a rapid overleaping, perhaps even by a crowded physical or biopsychic preparation whose results sprang out in the appearance of a new type with a certain gulf between itself and its preceding form of life. With regard to men, especially, there is still an enormous uncertainty as to how he, so like yet so different from the other sons of nature, came into existence. Still, the gaps can be explained away. There is a great mass of telling facts in favor of the less physically anarchic view, and it seemed to have on its side the right of greatest probability in a material universe where the most perfectly physical principle of proceeding would seem to be the just basic law. But even if we admit the most scrupulous and rigorous continuity of successive determination, the question arises whether the process of evolution have been indeed so exclusively physical and biological as at first sight it looks. If it is, we must admit not only a rigorous principle of class hereditary, but a law of hereditary progressive variation and a purely physical cause of all mental and spiritual phenomena. Heredity by itself means simply the constant transmission of physical form and biological characteristics from a previous life to its posterity. There is every evidently such a great force of hereditary transmission within the genus or species itself as the tree, so the seed, so the tree, so that a lion generates a lion and not a cat or a rhinoceros, a man, a human being, and not an orangutan. Though one reads now of a curious and startling speculation turning the old theory topsy-turvy that certain ape kinds may be not ancestors but degenerate descendants of men. But further, if a physical evolution is the whole fact, there must be a capacity for the hereditary transmission of variation by which new species are or have been created not merely in the process of a mixture or crossing, but by an internal development which is stored up and handed down in the seed. That too may very well be admitted, even though its real process and rationale are not yet understood, since the transmission of family and individual characteristic is a well observed phenomenon. But then the things transmitted are not only physical and biological, but psychological or at least psychic characters, repetitions of customary nervous experience, and mental tendency power. We have to suppose that the physical seed transmit these things. We are called upon to admit that the human seed, for instance, which does not contain a developed human consciousness, yet carries with it the powers of such a consciousness so that they reproduce themselves automatically in the thinking and organized mentality of offspring. This, even if we have to accept it, is an inexplicable paradox unless we suppose either that there is something more behind a psychical power behind the wheel of material process, or else the mind is only a process of life and life only a process of matter. Therefore, finally, we have to suppose that the physical theory capable of explaining by purely material cause and a material constitution the mystery of the emergence of life in matter and the equal mystery of the emergence of mind in life, it is here that difficulties begin to crowd in which convict it so far, at least, of a hopeless inadequacy, and the nature of that inadequacy, its crux, its stumbling point, leave room for just that something behind, something physical, a hidden soul process, and for a more complex and less materialistic account of the truth of evolution. The materialistic assumption, it is no more than a hypothetical assumption, for it has never been proved, is that development of non-living matter results under certain unknown conditions in a phenomenon of unconscious life, which is in its real nature only an action and reaction of material energy, and the development of that again under certain unknown conditions in a phenomenon of conscious mind, which is again in its real nature only an action and reaction of material energy. The thing is not proved, but that it is argued does not matter. It only means that we do not yet know enough, but one day we shall know the necessary physiological reaction called by us an intuition or train of reasoning crowned by discovery having, I suppose, taken place in a properly constituted nervous body and the more richly convoluted brain of a Galileo of biology. And then this great and simple truth will be proved, like many others once scoffed at by the shallow common sense of humanity, but the difficulty is that it seems incapable of proof, even with regard to life, which is by a great deal or the lesser difficulty the discovery of certain chemical or other physical and mechanical condition under which life can be stimulated to appear will prove no more than that these are the favorable or necessary conditions for the manifestation of life in body. Such condition there must be in the nature of things, but not that life is not another new and higher power of life of universal being. The connection of life responses with physical conditions and stimuli proves very clearly that life and matter are connected, and that as indeed they must do to coexist. The two kinds of energy act with each other, a very ancient knowledge, but it does not get rid of the fact that the physical response is accompanied by an element which seemed to be of the nature of the nervous excitement and an incipient or suppressed consciousness, and is not the same as the companion physical reaction. When we come to mind, we see how could it be otherwise in an embodied mind, a response, interaction, connection, a correspondence, if you will, but no amount of correspondence can show how a physical response can be converted into or amount to by itself constitute in result a conscious operation, a perception, emotion, thought, concept, or proof that love is a chemical product, or that Plato's theory of ideas or Homer's Iliad or the cosmic consciousness of the Yogian was only a combination of his physiological reaction or a complex of the changes of gray brain matter or a flaming marvel of electrical discharges. It is not only the common sense and imagination boggle at these theories that objection may be disregarded, not only that perception, reason, and intuition have to be thrust aside in favor of a forced and too extended interference, but that there is a gulf of difference here between the things to be explained, and that the thing by which it is sought to explain in which cannot be filled up, however much we may admit nervous connection and psychophysical bridges. And if the physical scientist points to a number of indicative facts and hopes one day to triumph over these formidable difficulties, there is growing up on the other side an incipient mass of physical phenomena which are likely to drown his theory in fathomless waters. The insuperability of this always evident objections is beginning to be more widely recognized, but since the past still holds considerable sway, it is necessary to insist on them so that we may have the clear right to go on to more liberal hypotheses which do not try prematurely to reduce to a mechanical simplicity the problem of our being. One of this is the ancient view that not only incidence of body and life on mind and soul, but incidence of mind and soul on body and life have to be considered. Here too there is an evolutionary idea, but physical and life evolution, even the growth of mind, are held to be incidental to a soul evolution by which time is the course and the earth, among many other worlds, the theater. In the old Indian version of this theory, evolution, hereditary, and rebirth are three companion processes of the universal unfolding. Evolution, the processional aim; rebirth, the main method; heredity, one of the physical conditions. That is the theory which provides at least the framework of a harmonious explanation of all complex elements of the problem. The scientific idea starts from the physical being and makes the physical a result and circumstances of body. This other evolutionary idea starts from the soul and sees in the physical being an instrumentation for the awakening to itself of a spirit absorbed in the universe of matter.